Thanks so much for tuning in to the Scaling People podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I am so glad to be chatting with Jessica Swank, Chief People Officer at Box. Jessica is an experienced public company CPO, having formerly led people functions at companies like HP and Blue Bottle. Jessica always has really practical, real advice, and so I'm interested into digging into AI and how that's going to affect HR work streams, org structure, productivity, all the things, which I know is something we're very much thinking about. So Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, Rasika, thank you so much for having me, and excited for a real talk conversation here today.
I love it. I love it. Let's get into it. Your CEO, Aaron Levie, has been pretty vocal about all these rapid advancements in AI and their impact on software development. And so I'm curious just to get your high-level take on how how you're preparing your workforce for the integration of all these new AI technologies. What tools are you already using? What effects are they having? Yeah, maybe we can start there.
Oh, great. So yes, for anyone who is not aware, Aaron Levie, our co-founder and CEO of Box, we have been on the forefront, I would say, of the AI evolution from the very beginning. And so Box is a product. We have incorporated AI into all of our platform, and so we use it internally on our own product. It is also not just, I would say, impacting SaaS. I would say AI is impacting everything in the world right now. And I think we are just at the beginning of, kind of the change curve. And we're still, I think, all in this exploration and trial learning as we go along the way. And so we have been very focused at Box on, again, not only using it as our own product, but then also thinking about where and how do we leverage external products across each of our different organizations. And so from our people and community standpoint, so the teams that I lead, we have been really focused on that we want to be on the cutting edge of this, that it's not only about, the tools that we are using, but then how do we, to your question, how do we make sure that what we call our boxers, our employees are ready for it, and how are we learning? How do we think about it from a privacy standpoint? How do we think about it from an adoption standpoint? How do we iterate and not just, sometimes it requires jumping in with 2 feet, but sometimes it's also better to take a step back and get a lay of the land and then be able to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. I think while there's a lot of excitement around AI, there's also this concern, I think, around job displacement, especially with the automation of all of these tasks. And so I'm just curious, how do you approach workforce planning to be more productive? And then from this job displacement or automation standpoint, what control or power do you think employees have to adapt their roles to contribute in a unique way so that, they can then contribute in a way that, complements some of the advances that these technologies are going to bring you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's definitely top of mind for a lot of folks, inside companies, and then I think overall across industries. So I would say, one, I'm a really big believer that the magic is going to happen with the co-creation of utilizing the technologies to then help us be more productive, to really think about how do we get more work done? How do we really think about the return on what we're doing? I am a big believer, though, that a lot of what makes us uniquely human, the ability to connect, to collaborate, that is not going to go away. And I think the folks with those types of skills are only going to be more successful going forward. And so what we've been really focusing on is really thinking about, taking an example within our own space, right? We are upcoming performance review season. And so rather than say, what does this mean? We're trying to be early adopters, and we're saying, hey, utilize the technology, right? Don't, use it as to augment the work that you're doing. So, for example, use it to summarize the reviews, use it to, if you're having a tough time putting into words some feedback, utilize AI tools, utilize it to help you be more effective and more efficient, not necessarily totally displaced. Now, I think there are going to be some jobs, potentially even some parts of the segments of work where it does, replace it. And yet I think, I tend to be an optimist, but I think that the ability then for us to then unleash and unlock some of the work that we actually is going to have the higher impact is a huge positive longer term benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've even heard your CEO share that, a lot of times when you do have a function where certain segments are automated, you then end up reinvesting a lot of those resources to continue to build that because more work gets created. Like when you're able to move at a higher velocity, then there's like 10 new things that you need to do. And so really it's a lot about that like cross training and upskilling so that then the employees can kind of meet the new demands that then come.
Absolutely. And I think you just said that very well of it just enables us to then innovate and continue to push the envelope and think about what more can we do? How do we really meet the needs of our customers even better? How do we anticipate? How do we use data to inform the decisions and then create that insight where then, automating tasks, automating workflows, really using it to, one of the best examples we've been using our own internal is like on our benefit site where, rather than, employees asking us questions and having to submit a, ticket, they then can go and use AI to answer the questions. And so I think there's just a lot of being able to improve the end result for customers and for employees.
Yeah. What does it look like when it comes down to accountability of this? Like, I know some leaders, they're encouraging their other leaders to leverage AI and to drive productivity using some of these tools. Like to what degree do you kind of encourage versus you feel like the pace of work could be faster if some of these technologies are used or not? Like where's the kind of accountability as you think about how much you want to drive and enforce the utilization of this new tech?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that, again, across writ large, we're still figuring that out, right? I'll go to security is important, and the ability to really utilize it in a way that is effective is important. So like we've worked very closely with some of our legal teams and some of our policy teams. So we have some guidelines and some frameworks of how we want to use it internally. Again, we're also very focused on security and compliance and making sure that, data accountability, especially globally, that we are not utilizing the data in any way that's inappropriate. We're also trying to think about how to, some of the underbelly of AI, such as, all the concerns out there right now of how do we get ahead of it? How do we train our AI on biases, so that we're not thinking about that going forward. So in my opinion, we're trying to use it as fast as we can, as much as we can, and at the same time do it super responsibly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially when you're on the cusp of something new, it really is sort of like an art and a science, and you kind of have to sort of observe, measure, iterate, and kind of see what happens as you roll it out. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, one of our values at Box is take risks, fail fast. And so I think that is just our philosophy of how do we continue to innovate? How do we push the envelope? And yet how do we learn? How do we go, oops, maybe that didn't work as we had thought, and how do we adjust? And so I think, again, we're all kind of in this learning space and learning from each other, sharing best practices across the board. And then two, you talked about and mentioned about technology. So we're also looking at, also leveraging third-party technology. So one of our big focuses has been looking at our end-to-end tech stack and how do we think about our evolving evolution of tools? How do we, leverage existing tools maybe that are implementing AI? How do we get some new AI tools, especially, that we can believe are game changers going forward? And then some we're piloting, some we're doubling down on, and some we've piloted and we've said no, but actually is not getting the result that we wanted or the return that we wanted, and so we're sunsetting them.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like a comparison I like to use with that is the office environment. I think just because I know some companies are like, okay, we're doing 5 days return to work, we're going to be more productive. And in some cases that may be true. In some cases it may not. Just because you use this new AI tool doesn't mean all of a sudden you're going to be like, what does productivity look like? How are you measuring it? And then how is this tool kind of, augmenting some of the work you're doing? It's not always just because you do this, all of a sudden you're going to be productive. So I think having the measurement, as you described it, is an important part of that. So
yeah. And I think productivity is just such an interesting word these days because I think it's really easy to measure, productivity as like input output versus like what is the outcome that it is driving. And so, if you can shorten maybe the time that it takes you to deliver, a project or a program, is it the quality? Is it the right project, right? So I think also us being really clear on just working faster all the time and just producing more doesn't necessarily mean that it's better or it's driving the innovation or it's driving the outcomes that we want.
Right. Yeah. That's such a great segue to another topic I wanted to pick your brain on, which is this shift that we've observed over the last, say, year or 2 years, where, there's much more of a focus, I would say, this year than maybe call it 2022 on this performance-driven culture, building a performance-driven culture. And so I'm just curious, do you think some of this is a response to the rise of this AI race and the unpredictable macro and the need to, win that race? Or is this part of a larger cultural shift that's kind of re-leveling back from the zero interest rate environment that's here to stay? Like, what do you kind of see that in response to, and what's kind of a trend, and what do you think is here to stay?
Yeah, it's a great question and very timely. A couple of things. I think, yes to all that you just mentioned, right? I think there's always cycles in business, that I've observed, and things, kind of come and go. And so I think the pendulum swung pretty far to a little bit maybe more of an entitled culture where it was all about, kind of the war for talent and anything that anybody asked our employees, right? I think a lot of companies would try to cater to that. I think now with a lot of the tightening of the macro environment, it's, super challenging and really making sure that companies are profitable. And then I think some of the shifts broader, more, from a social, political standpoint, I think there is going to be increased focus. There has been and will continue to be increased focus on performance. I also think of it like a Venn diagram. I always think of it like there's different constituents. So, what's best for the individual, and then what's best for the team, and then what's best maybe for the company. And sometimes those overlap, sometimes they don't. And so I think, in this sense of, hey, I know at Box, like we're very much into, we drive we have very high expectations. We drive to high performance, but culture, the sense of belonging, how we get work done remains incredibly important. And so I know for us, for example, performance is absolute paramount, but also how you do it. So we talk a lot about it's not only what you do it, but how you do it. And I think I'm hoping that as a culture, as an industry, as professionals, we take some of the lessons learned through the pandemic, through some of those changes, and not totally let them go, but that we continue to marry it with that we have to be profitable, we have to be productive. We can't necessarily just cater to every single individual employee needs. We have to find that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think in the pandemic, around that time, I think what was lost was the thread, because I think, to your point, a lot of these things, these initiatives around culture and how we work, like, the research, everything shows that those do generally produce higher performing cultures. But I think sometimes the thread of how 1 + 1 = 2 is lost. And so there was just, investment being made in one area, but not necessarily measured, or maybe not communicated in the best. And so I think bringing these two things together, while also recognizing that it is an art and a science, it's going to be hard to, directly measure the investment of this and how it affected your, revenue, your gross profit that year. That's kind of an ongoing balance that I'm curious to see how it levels out this year. So,
yeah. And one thing you mentioned in the initial question too was the role that maybe AI has played in this. And I do think, it just has kept us all on our toes thinking about, hey, everybody now has this tool. Everybody can work a little bit smarter, faster, potentially. And so I do think it's a bar raiser across the board. And I think something that we need to take account for. But again, I don't think that it is the only reason why there's increased attention, focus on performance, and both performance of companies, but also I think performance of individuals within organizations.
Yeah. Specifically kind of thinking about some of these bigger AI companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google's DeepMind, it feels like while maybe every company isn't rapidly hiring, the talent battle has very much begun within this kind of group of companies. And so What do you think people teams can do to ensure the company attracts and retains top talent in the AI space? Is there anything that you're doing in particular, any practices or processes you've had to adopt or you've seen work well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're absolutely spot on. Very competitive environment right now. I joke that if anybody has, AI in their title, that they can, not always, but at least try to get a premium.
Mm-hmm.
I think a couple of things is one, there's a lot of companies are doing this very well. And so I think the drive to innovation, the drive to change is real. And so finding people not necessarily with, deep expertise in this area, because there are a few folks that actually do have that deep expertise. Mm-hmm. But where we've been also focusing on is how do you find folks with the right mindset, with that learning agility, where mm-hmm. they can, maybe partner with somebody who is really deep more on the AI space, but who can also bring, different perspective. And so I think there's a lot of room, and there's going to be, just so much growth in this space over the next couple of years. And one thing we're really encouraging, again, is just every employee, everybody use it, right? Everybody become an expert. And I know I can really have emphasized this across our people team too, of, hey, we need to also make sure that we are utilizing it, that we're understanding it, so that we can also, recognize it externally, but then also make sure that we're, retaining, that we are able to reskill, we're able to shift people as needed into growth areas. Not everybody can do that, but I think in a lot of times those transferable skills are going to be even more important than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know management programs is very common. Companies have that because that's a skill that you don't necessarily, isn't inherent in the role, and then you get promoted into this role. And so that's why companies have these manager programs. Do you think there's going to be, with AI, is that something that you think you just kind of have to experiment with and play with? Or do you think more concentrated or curated programs are going to emerge within companies to upskill and, just kind of give people more tools there?
Yeah, I think it's going to be both. So we actually have developed internal training on it that we ask and we offer to all employees to take on, kind of thinking about and utilizing it. And again, not only for our box product, but then just more broadly. We also, our CTO, we do a lot of work, kind of brown bags and, group meetings, or, our quarterly meetings as a company, really talking and helping to educate of where the industry's been, where it's going. Of course, Erin is front and center. And so I think it's hard to ignore it when you're working at Box. But again, I think I am a huge advocate that everybody should, no matter where you are in your career, at least play around with it, and then take the opportunities to continue to learn, to read, to help us shape. Because again, we're all in this together, and we're all learning and evolving along the way.
Yeah, I think those types of informal programs are the best. I remember at a previous company I was at, there were 3 co-founders, and 2 of them just got tired of the charts that they would see presented at the all company meetings, just not being as clear as they wanted, or the takeaway is as clear as they wanted, or maybe the things that were measured not being the most compelling measurements. And so, they shared that with me, and together we put the program together called Data Skeptics, where every quarter you could apply, and they would have, every Friday afternoon, a 1-hour session every Friday that quarter. And we would talk about real business problems. You'd kind of think about how you could leverage data to inform how you wanted to solve it. And they would, real time, everyone would workshop it together. And how often do you get that time, with your leadership team that's actively working on problems with you to kind of build a more universal skill set? So hearing that example with your CTO and your CEO, I think these are the opportunities and the moments where, that in real-time learning can be really powerful. So
and I think, any classic change curve, or there's going to be the early adopters, the people who are naturally gravitating. And I think it's as an organization and as industry, how do we get, the majority of folks really leveraging it and utilizing it? And then I think at some point it's going to be individual choice of, are you willing, interested to kind of get on the AI bus? Because I don't think it's going to be leaving any time, or it's already left. The bus has already left. So get on or catch it at the next stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask you about, looking at your background, you've worked at all kind of stages, but you've typically joined at later stage public companies. And so, especially in the context of everything we've been talking about, how do you come in and make an impact in your organization at a point where, a lot may have been cemented, driving change requires, moving more mountains, more large scale evolution. Yeah, how do you do that? Because you're not coming in at the seed state where you get to kind of invent everything on your own. That change is actually really hard. So yeah, how do you do that at the later stage well?
Yeah, it's a fun question. So I think one, change is constant at any organization, every size. And so one of the things that I've been very focused on throughout is just what is the business problem that we are trying to solve, and then how do you create solutions to solve that problem. And so I think it's too easy to also go in and say like, oh, we just need to drive change for change's sake, and yet really anchoring it on what problem are we trying to solve. And so, I personally, I've been did a lot of consulting for small companies. I've been at kind of various sizes at Box where, about 3,000, almost 3,000 people globally. I actually love this size because it is small enough where you can actually still make pretty big changes, and innovation is, very robust here at Box. But it is more complicated, right? The old, the kind of the Dilbert joke about, the meeting before the meeting. That's real, right? You don't want to walk into a meeting and have no idea what people feel about it. So there is, I think, probably takes a little bit longer and a little bit more socialization. That said, I think, one of the things about being like a founder-led, organization still is that there's a lot of things that we move very quickly on. And so I think being able to also be very clear on what changes are going to, again, drive the business outcomes and the why you want to make the change. I've actually seen sometimes larger companies move faster than small companies just because, if you get the right people on board.
Right. Yeah, it is a unique dynamic at Box. You're a public company. You still have the founder there. You're at that, 3,000 person sweet spot. So I imagine that can be very fun. I think just to wrap, going back to what we were talking about earlier, it does feel like a lot of times in tech, there are these pendulum swings where, there's this focus on growth and everyone's hiring. And so you're also hiring and maybe focused on the things that are going to allow you to close those hires and entice them. And then all of a sudden the pendulum swings the other way and the focus is on profitability. And so you're cracking down on productivity and performance and, where you can cut back. And sometimes those sharp swings can feel unproductive in a business. And so I'm just curious how, especially as a, mid to larger size organization, like how do you find the balance where, just because everybody's doing X, like if it doesn't feel right or like, maybe you don't want to give in on X, Y, and Z, but it's going to affect how quickly you are able to make some key hires, or, maybe you do feel like there's a better balance for your business on profitability versus growth. Like how do you just find the balance so that you're not constantly just reacting to everything happening externally, or is that just kind of part of it and you will swing a little?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question because I think that what you said is there will always be, I think, some swings. To me, it's how do you narrow the window of those swings so that you don't cause as much thrash and disruption in the organization. And so, for the past couple of years, we've been super hyper focused on what we've called profitable growth, right? So really balancing profitability, and we've been doing, real big push on, how do we make sure that, every single dollar we're spending as wisely as possible. So like we have chosen to stay super lean. So we're 3,000 people almost, but we're super lean and super scrappy, kind of that startup DNA still in our heart. And yet I do think that driving growth is incredibly important, and understanding though, it's how much do you hire ahead for possible growth, or how much do you, so one of the things we've done, for example, is we've then had to make some hard, just trade-offs within the business to say, we don't have, X number of heads to go and hire, for all the new like AI technology, or some of our platform technology or ICM work. And yet, how do we maybe, shift some resources internally and think about what are we going to stop doing? So I think prioritization is actually incredibly important. And then, I also think it's having very open and honest conversations with your board to make sure that folks are aligned on, what is the goal for that year. And it might evolve, but trying to get ahead of it and, not have to hire and then fire. So, really one of the things I'm most proud of is, we have not actually done any extensive layoffs throughout all of the changes because we've been super thoughtful and conservative and yet really trying to invest in the right areas.
Yeah. Yeah. This concept of focus, I think, becomes really important, both when you're doing well and when you're maybe not doing as well as you want in a startup of, oh, we could try this idea or we could try this, or like we have the resources to do it or nothing's working. So let's try all these things. But this idea of like figure out what you're bad at and, focus on like one or two or three things, whatever it is. I think when you pick a couple too many, that's when the head count just starts adding up and it's hard to measure success. What's really working, what's kind of distracting, pulling resources away from the thing that could be generating more revenue for you. So sounds like you guys do that pretty well. Yeah,
absolutely. And knowing what time horizon you're solving on, because a lot of the solutions, right, you have to invest years ahead. And so it doesn't necessarily see it in the next quarter. And yet there are some investments where if you don't see the results and within quarter or after a quarter or two, you have to make, again, those hard pivots. And, I've always say it's like deciding what to do. And not to do is just as important. And so you have to understand both of what are we going to intentionally put aside and maybe put it on a back burner for the betterment of doubling down on the areas that you think are going to have the biggest ROI and return.
Yeah. And choosing the window in which to make those decisions, like choosing which window you're optimizing for. Do you make that decision based on how much runway you have or just on the type of business model you have? Like, how do you decide whether you should be optimizing for that, quarter to quarter, 1 year or 3 year or whatever?
Yeah, I think it depends somewhat on where you are in the business model and where you are within that scaling. So, I think early startups definitely drive more towards, growth. And then I think more, especially once you go public, that focus on profitability becomes much more front and center for better or for worse. And I also think that it's really important to understand where the market is going and, again, where you are you chasing market share? Are you chasing profitability? How investors reacting? So trying to take that all into account when deciding where and how to invest. And then I think too, right, the wish list of things that we want to do is, much longer than what we're able to. And so I think it's also willing to and that courage to say, we're going to double down in this area and not in this area. And here's the reasons why, even though I think, especially, you get a lot of innovative, creative people together and they all have their project or they all think they, the work that they want to go do. And then just so driving that alignment and consistency and communicating that really clearly is, I think, a really important part of that success.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, it just feels like the world is moving at warp speed. The things are changing faster and faster and faster, which, has different effects in our day-to-day job. And so I really appreciate you coming on the show, sharing your insights, some really practical takeaways as, others are also thinking about many of the same themes. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Jessica. Until next time.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the conversation.